Welcome. Good evening, everyone. And so good to have so many of you IHNers here and some other people visiting as well. So my name is Anna. I am the head administrator for the Institute of Holistic Nutrition's in-class and online Eastern Time Zone program. So tonight, I am delighted to introduce you, everyone, to Lisa Pitel-Killah. She is the instructor for IHN's newest continuing education partnership for HTMA Practitioner Level 1 course. It's coming up this June, on June 14th. But you know what? Lisa will tell you a lot more about it throughout this webinar or at the end of the webinar. So let me tell you a little bit about Lisa. Lisa is a practitioner of functional diagnostics, which bridges the gap between clinical nutrition and functional medicine. She is a hair tissue mineral analysis practitioner, excuse me, and is part of a consortium of mineral experts, as well as the co-founder of the HTMA Virtual Summit that hosts an annual event bringing education on mineral balancing to practitioners around the world. Lisa is a longstanding member of the Association of Functional Diagnostic Nutrition Professionals and consults with health practitioners around the globe on the assessment, analysis, and implementation of HTMA in their healthcare practices. She is a health, wellness, and fitness advocate who has traveled the world competing internationally and is a multi-time kettlebell sport world champion. Wow. Lisa brings years of clinical experience as she and her team have supported clients from all over the world using a holistic approach to healing with mineral balance. As the founder of Vicon Supplements, she heads up all research and development with regards to new breakthroughs with mineral practices and protocols. Lisa is a faculty member at IHN, teaching you the continuing education HTMA practitioner level certificate course. So there's a lot there. Lisa can explain and elaborate some more. So I'm going to pass it over to Lisa.
Oh my goodness, that's the long bio. Thank you so much, Anna. I think I'm blushing. Like, oh my goodness. I'm like, is that me? I don't think that's even mine. What's happening right now? Thank you for that. I definitely don't think I need to add anything there. That was pretty in depth. But yeah, I'm excited about tonight's webinar. I'm excited about our upcoming course starting June 14th. We've had so much interest. I'm so happy to hear that so many people are interested in using this in their practice, because honestly, I've seen thousands of lives changed with what minerals can do, because they really are the foundation of health. And we're going to talk about that tonight. So, I think without further ado, let's get started. I want to get into the webinar. I want to get into calcium shell. I have a great case study to share with you guys tonight that I think you'll find really, really interesting. And then, of course, pop your questions into the Q&A. I'm happy to answer those when we're done. Okay. So if everybody's ready, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. So I think we're good to go here. Can everybody, Anna, can you just give me a yes, because I can't see you anymore, that everything is good, looking good on your end, please?
Yes, I see your slides and I see you. Perfect.
Excellent. Okay, good. That is perfect. Just need to get my mouse back and we'll be all good. There it is. All right. So calcium shell, that's our topic for tonight. One of the things I want to start with, because again, some of you might be new, maybe you didn't see or haven't seen any of my recent or past webinars. And so I just wanted to spend just a few minutes kind of just talking about HTMA, giving you a little background on it. And then we're going to dive right into calcium, why it's so important and what dysregulation looks like. And so HTMA, hair tissue mineral analysis. It's when a hair sample is used to evaluate its mineral content. It's a window into the cell's mineral activity. Analyzing hair tissue will bring to light toxicities and issues within the body, sometimes months or even years before they'll ever be detected in blood serum testing. They show us an average of the mineral system activity over a 3 to 4 month period, which is really great because we can see, the most recent pattern. If you're taking the hair sample properly from close to the scalp, we can see current patterns, but over the course of a longer period of time rather than just a snapshot in blood work. And so this particular chart is the nutritional element, or what I call the vital mineral chart. And this is from Trace Elements Lab. So this is my preferred lab. It's in Texas. There are 2, even 3 labs that I recommend, and I'll go through those as we go through as well. So this particular one, we're just going to look at it for basic HTMA overview. And so it tests for 37 different elements, including our vital minerals, which are the ones you see here, additional elements, which include things like lithium, barium, rubidium, and our heavy metals, of course, mercury, aluminum, etc. So when analyzing any one mineral, we have to look at the big picture, and that includes the big four minerals. So if you haven't heard about the big four minerals, those are the first four minerals from left to right on our nutritional element chart. So that includes calcium, magnesium, sodium, and potassium. And why are these so important? Because they make up the majority of numbers utilized to be able to analyze our significant ratios. And the significant ratios really do tell us a lot about what's happening in the body. So let's look at those. So there's 7 main ratios. All of them identify systems of the body and how they're working at a cellular level. These were actually discovered back in the 70s with some of the work that Dr. Paul Eck, who has now passed on, and also David Watts, who is still running Trace Elements Lab, discovered in that time. So identifying imbalances here may be seen weeks again or months prior to blood work showing a problem, maybe with an underactive thyroid or underactive adrenals. There's things that we can identify earlier. Blood always wants to be homeostatic, and that's one of these reasons. So it will pull or deposit minerals out or into tissues based on its own levels. And that's why blood can stay in homeostasis for such a long period of time. Therefore, HTMA can be used as a preventative measure to make sure that the body is functioning optimally. The balance of these significant ratios may actually be more important than the levels of individual minerals themselves, which is a very interesting fact. And so let's talk about the minerals or the ratios, what they actually represent. So we have 7. First one is calcium to phosphorus. That's what we call the metabolic ratio, or the identifier of the oxidation rate. And when this level is high, that means the body is in that rest and digest, that parasympathetic dominance. When it's low, it's the opposite, fight or flight. So now we're in sympathetic dominance. So we really want that to be in balance so that our body is more stress resilient and that we have a balanced metabolic rate. Sodium to potassium, this is the most important of the 7 significant ratios. We call this the vitality ratio or also the stress ratio. And so stress ratio, because it's based on the work done by Dr. Hans Selye, who talks about the stages of stress. And so when this ratio is really high, that means we're in an alarm, acute stage of stress. When it's ideal, of course, we're in that more resilient stage of stress. And when it's really low, that's when the body's in that exhaustive stage of stress. So you can really see someone's stress level from a physiological perspective when we're analyzing the sodium to potassium. The thyroid ratios are calcium to potassium, very important, obviously, to be in balance. Our zinc to copper is our hormone ratio. Adrenal ratio is represented by the sodium divided by magnesium. Our blood sugar ratio is calcium divided by magnesium. And what we call the infection ratio is iron divided by copper. And so again, showing us some really important factors that we need to consider when we're looking at increasing someone's functionality in order for them to detox heavy metals, maybe deal with fatigue issues, maybe we have a copper dysregulatory issue. You know, there's lots of things that need good functionality. And you can see, actually, I use this particular significant ratio chart to show this, but this is one of that I've seen that is actually a very good level. And this particular one is one of our clients, and this was her second test after doing a protocol. And you can see 6 out of 7 of those ratios are within the range. And, you know, 5 almost are at the ideal level. So really, really good patterns for significant ratios in that particular chart. So I want to just touch on fast oxidation because that's really not what we're going to be talking about tonight. We're talking about a buildup of calcification in the tissues. And that happens with something called slow oxidation. Fast oxidation is, of course, the opposite. So we can see here the calcium to phosphorus is below the ideal level at 1.69. And so in this particular case, we have someone who's going to have a bit of an overactive thyroid, bit of overactive adrenals, a higher production of aldosterone, attraction to higher levels of meat and fat. So normally fast oxidizers do really well on higher fat and moderate protein diets. They don't need a lot of carbohydrates because they burn through them too quickly. They have a tendency to be very warm. They have an excess retention of sodium and potassium. And these are the people that are at risk for severe calcium and magnesium deficiency. So on the other end of the spectrum versus what we're talking about this evening. So here's the meat and potato building blocks of what we're looking at for tonight's session. And so it all starts with the slow oxidizer. And so what does that mean for us? Well, the calcium to phosphorus here, you can see it is a bit elevated. It's at 3.94. That's the one with the red circle. Slow adrenal and slow thyroid activity. Now, the one thing I want everyone to understand is we're not using HTMA to diagnose hypothyroidism or anything like that. We are looking at it from a mineral perspective, from a basis perspective, as to how the minerals affect the absorption, right? The inhibition of the cell to uptake thyroxine and what will create that cell's permeability for thyroxine. And that's, of course, calcium and potassium. So that's what we're analyzing here. And a lot of times when you make changes, there really isn't an underlying condition associated with it. It's just the fact that the minerals are not in balance. There's a lower production of aldosterone in this particular pattern. There's a very poor retention of sodium and potassium. And of course, sodium is directly related to adrenal response, and potassium is related to the absorption of course, T4, which is supporting our thyroid. Calcium builds up in the tissues in most cases, and magnesium is then bio-unavailable. So they may have enough magnesium, but it's being lost through the hair. And that's one thing we'll touch on tonight too. So to just give you a general overview, the building blocks of health, right? Minerals really do bring that to the table. I call it the foundation of the house. And so they're needed for millions of enzymes as cofactors, facilitators, and inhibitors, and as part of the enzymes themselves. Their bioavailability and usability both have a great deal to do with the actual human health of the human body. Minerals are the underbelly of what lies above. Without mineral balance, a cascade of metabolic chaos may ensue. And again, that's when things start going awry, and all of a sudden we have problems that are pushing into other systems now that we're not solving. And so that's really the foundation of where we can support those things. And so the principles of minerals, you can see here I included a picture because this is, every time I look at it, I'm always so fascinated because really, when we're looking at minerals and we're looking at elements, there are so many arrows going so many different ways with interactions. And this is where, HTMA becomes quite complex to a certain point. There is simplicity you can put onto it, but there is a lot of complexity underlying it. And so, being able to understand the interrelationships of minerals are really important to be able to, evaluate the testing appropriately and correctly. So Dr. Paul Eck, who I mentioned, his law of mineral states every mineral has an effect on every other mineral. And that is so true. Most people around the world, this is his words, again, most people around the world are mineral deficient. Symptoms of a mineral deficiency are often identical to a symptom of a mineral excess or a biounavailable buildup. And we'll talk about that tonight too. And that's a really interesting fact. Minerals can substitute or displace one another. Balance is expressed in ratios mathematically through the significant ratios. Main minerals need to be maintained and supported in a certain balance or disease results. The biounavailability of a mineral is paramount, right? We need to make sure that minerals are bioavailable so that our body can use them in an appropriate fashion. So that's your quick overview. So now let's talk about calcium. So why do we need it? Well, calcium, if you didn't know this, is a very emotional mineral. And we're going to get into what the psychological effects are of calcium shell in a few minutes. It's a structural element. 99% of calcium is actually in the bones and the teeth. It regulates cell permeability. It's important for blood clotting and maintains pH balance. It supports fat digestion. It inhibits the uptake of thyroxine, plays a role in muscle and nerve contraction and relaxation. An imbalance relative to its synergistic and antagonistic nutrients can be a major contributor to osteoporosis. And we're going to go through a case study via osteoporosis tonight. And the ideal level, just for your own information, on an HTMA that we're looking for is 42 milligram percent. And so what is calcium dysregulation? It really comes down, I tried to simplify it as much as possible. And so calcium dysregulation, for the purpose of defining calcium shell, which is what we're doing this evening, is the buildup of biounavailable calcium in the tissues of the body. This can be assessed on HTMA testing to the severity of the level of the buildup, because you can see it on the test as it's measured. Calcium that's building in the tissues will bring with it a host of symptoms, and if not addressed, may cause further burden on the body. And we're going to talk about some of those burdens as well. There are several factors that could contribute to tissue calcification, and that extensive list is coming up shortly. So first, let's look, how do we identify calcium shell? And there's different levels of calcium shell. So I want to talk about all of those tonight. So calcium shell identified. So here is a typical pattern. And it's typical to a certain extent because this particular pattern, remember we talked about the slow oxidizer in our significant ratios and how that elevated calcium is based on starting out with slow oxidation. So a very easy way to identify a slow oxidizer without the ratios is a very elevated calcium and magnesium and an extremely low sodium and potassium. You can see that very clearly here when you look at this chart. And so the difference here is that, not everybody is in a calcium shell. We may have elevated calcium at 100 or 110. We consider calcium shell to start when the level is greater than 170 milligram percent. And you can see here in this particular example, it's 236. The higher the calcium level, the more severe the shell. So another example. So this would be considered a severe calcium shell. And so this is a different test. You're looking at it going, oh my goodness, that chart looks different than the last ones we looked at. And so this particular one, so the charts in this particular presentation are from Trace Elements, the lab that's run by Dr. Watts. And this particular chart is from Analytical Research Labs, which is the other lab that I recommend. They're in Arizona. And this is the late Paul X lab, and his family now runs it. And so a severe calcium shell is considered to be when the level is greater than 250 milligram percent. And sometimes, I put this in brackets because I didn't want to forget to mention it, sometimes it can come from severe trauma. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the psychological implications of what calcium shell can bring in a bit. But, when we are in a trauma and we're going through dealing with that trauma, in most cases, we kind of go through that shock period and we kind of close in on ourselves a little bit. And that protective barrier really acts like a calcium shell will to your cells. And so it really just tries to kind of close you off from any more, traumatic experience or hurt or whatever is to come your way. And so, sometimes these levels can stay quite high, and sometimes it's related to the the need to release some of that trauma because people will hang on to it. But at this level, because it's an extreme elevation, it can lead to cancer, despair, and being very out of touch with reality. So you're really not present today to understand or be part of a realistic daily life to a certain extent when it gets to extreme levels. And so let's talk about what that extreme level might look like. So this is not the highest level I've ever seen. The highest level I've seen to date is 611 milligram percent. And so this particular case, I pulled this particular chart because this was a client I had, oh my goodness, years and years ago. And she came to me because she had been diagnosed with lupus and had severe inflexibility and also just a lot of pain. She was had a lot of arthritis issues. There was a lot going on with regards to her threshold for pain. And so you can see with the calcium being at 543 milligram percent, this is an extremely severe calcium shell. And when you see something like this, and again, it's not all that common, but I've seen it now, in the past almost decade. I've probably seen it maybe 8 times, maybe 10. I feel like that's too many, maybe 8. So you don't see it all that often, but you do see it. And so we've got severely impaired cell permeability. We've got calcification, which could result in kidney stones, severe constipation. You're looking at accelerated aging, increased cell death, and an immensely decreased metabolic rate, of course. You've got an extreme magnesium loss. And so that's one of the, when I talk about reading and assessing all those minerals together, when you have a calcium level at that, level that high, then the magnesium isn't high. It's being lost in the hair because the body is under so much stress. And so again, this particular client was suffering from lupus and had an unbearable amount of daily pain. And this isn't one of the case studies, because I chose an osteoporosis case study this evening, but she, over the course of a year, made some really great improvements with the right protocol. And I'm proud to say for the last, I think, 6 years, it's been since I've worked with her, she's been pain-free. So there is a lot you can do, even with a case like this. So causal factors, this is really important. What causes calcium to end up being, 200 or 300 or even 500 milligram percent? Magnesium deficiency is one. Magnesium and calcium are antagonists at a certain level. And so if we have magnesium deficiency, it allows calcium to rise. Calcium supplementation is another one. I see this all the time, right? Women at a certain age, close to my age, because I'm getting to that age too, it's like you should be supplementing with calcium, osteoporosis. Think about these things. Your hormones are changing, and there is so much validity to that. But if the calcium isn't being utilized properly once it's entering the body with the other nutrients it needs to be absorbed and metabolized and transported, then there's a problem. And that's when we have that dysregulation. A biounavailable buildup of copper, right? That could come from the using hormone replacement therapy or, birth control or IUDs. Those things can increase the calcification of tissues. Emotional trauma, as I mentioned. Iodine deficiency is another one. Hypothyroidism is another one that will cause that calcium elevation. Slow oxidation. So remember when we saw that high calcium to phosphorus level, that as well will allow calcium to build. Adrenal exhaustion because of the stress on the body, that will allow calcium to build in the tissues. Stress burns magnesium at higher rates, right? So when we're under stress, whether it's acute, whether it is chronic, our body is burning more magnesium at a very high rate. So when you're very stressed, or even if you're going through a really stressful period, increasing your magnesium intake might be a really good idea to be able to make sure that your body is as healthy as possible during that stressful time. Hard well water, right? Hard well water that we're not filtering. You see I remember when we moved to the country and we have really hard water. And so we had hooked up our coffee maker, like we have a special one that hooks up to the sink. And we ended up having to replace it after like 3 months because it was so calcified. We couldn't use it anymore. It actually didn't work. So, think about that in your body, right? That could potentially happen if that's the water that you're constantly drinking and you're not filtering it. Excess estrogen kind of goes back hand in hand with that biounavailable copper because estrogen and copper are so succinctly related, but it lowers calcium excretion, which if at that time, we don't need that to happen, then it can start to build in the tissues. And then I wanted to put this one in because it's very relevant. And when we're talking about minerals, I always hear detox or, detox heavy metals. And there's lots of therapies out there to do that. I always look at it as, and I get this from people that I have studied with for years. And, the biggest thing that I know, because I've seen it happen time and time again, is when you have metals and they're related to certain minerals, right? Zinc, cadmium, mercury, they're very interrelated. They're very close on the periodic table. And so if you are zinc deficient, for example, your body may sequester mercury or cadmium that's in its environment because it doesn't have the zinc that it needs. So when you start supplying your body with those vital minerals, then all of a sudden the body's like, well, I don't need this mercury anymore. I can let it go. And that's what happens. But sometimes people want to go after the heavy metals, right? They want to dive after, they see those, they're like, oh, those shouldn't be in my body. They're not thinking about the mineral it's related to that may be deficient, right? And so EDTA, chelation therapy, I was recommended this. So I'm going to share a tiny little story with my HTMA with regards to my use of this and why I don't normally put it in any of my protocols. I really don't. I mean, I think in certain cases, of course, acute cases, toxic, acute toxicity, totally, I understand that might be necessary, but just with our mineral balance that we're talking about here, some negative things that can come along. So this was my test back in early 2019. And I was doing really good. My protocol was going well. Everything was kind of leveling out. And, but I still had a little bit of uranium, right? It's very geographical where we are. And I had a little bit of mercury. So I was like, okay, well, I'll try this. It was recommended. So I'm going to give it a try. And so I used so here's what happened. Calcium was at 68 milligram percent. Now remember the ideal is 42. So it was just a little high, should be lower, but it was a little high. And then it shot up to 185 milligram percent. So it literally went up almost 120 milligram percent in a very, very short period of time. And I'm going to talk about what that looks like in a sec. The magnesium loss, you can see here, it was magnified. So the magnesium loss here is 50.3 milligram percent. So it's extreme magnesium loss. And so what that means is now we have a decrease in cell permeability. So we've got a lot of things going on here. And then just as an honorable mention, the cobalt, because cobalt, when we see it like this, a lot of times that comes back to liver stress and congestion. So I wanted to just touch that. So now this is exactly what I did for that to happen. So normally chelation therapy, depending on what you're using, this was a milder one, to be honest. And so it was supposed to be 30 suppositories. So you used it for 30 days. And then, you went on your merry way doing whatever you were going to do. And so again, based on my uranium levels, I thought, well, I'll try it. And I used 5 suppositories out of the 30 every other night. I didn't even do it every night because after the first night, I was like, my GI doesn't feel great. Like I feel really bloated and I don't really feel great. I'm like, well, maybe I'm just going through detox. I'm not going to feel great. And so in 10 days, and I did, I do like to get to my end goal. So I was kind of pushing through this, but it was not a great situation. I was super constipated. I couldn't go to the bathroom. And I'm not normally like that. I gained 15 pounds in 10 days. My flexibility went down to 0. At the time I was training pretty heavily, so it was not a great situation. And especially in my spine. So when I went to the gym, for example, one of my favorite warm-ups is just to get on the roller and just roll my back. Right? It kind of loosens everything up, right? Get your nerve endings firing and, you get ready to stretch out everything else before you start lifting. And I couldn't do that anymore. It was actually too painful. I constantly felt full. So I completely lost my appetite. And then I had super extreme fatigue and lots of joint pain. And I was also suffering from insomnia. So, just that short period of time with that particular therapy, that's kind of what the end result was, that my calcium shot up very, very quickly. And these were the symptoms that I was left with to kind of deal with and work my way through. So, I was at the time, I was like, okay, I know how to fix this. Let's just do it. But this is one of the reasons for myself and obviously for clients and our team that I'm not necessarily a huge fan of that type of chelation. So we've talked about some symptoms because obviously I shared mine, but let's talk about some of the symptoms related to calcium shell and when that's present. So first ones are psychological. So there's definitely, like I said, calcium is a very emotional mineral in the body. And so there's some psychological symptoms that come along with that buildup of calcium. And so first one is psychological withdrawal. Remember I talked about kind of, we're putting that shield around us. We don't want any more hurt. We don't want to, maybe we don't want to talk to anybody right now. We're just not in the mood for that. But that's, but then all of a sudden it's for a long period of time, right? It doesn't stop. Difficulty handling stress, right? We're probably magnesium deficient, and magnesium, we need magnesium when we're stressed. Depression, defensiveness, disconnected, right? Out of touch with reality, just not really functioning on a high level day-to-day basis. Feelings of guilt, right? Maybe there was a trauma that you feel guilty for. Maybe something happened and you feel responsible. That's another thing that, again, we may need to use some therapy to be able to get through that. Brain fog, emotional outbursts sometimes, right? Where we get irritable and kind of that anger, right? Just kind of comes out all at once. If copper toxicity, so if biounavailable copper buildup is driving this pattern, then we could have racing thoughts, right? That's going to obviously lead to most likely insomnia, right? We can't sleep. It's like, I would say, when we have that insomnia that's related to biounavailable copper buildup, your body's exhausted. You're laying in bed and you're just like, oh, I'm so happy to be here. And you close your eyes and it's like your mind, it's like watching one of those movies and fast forward and your mind is just going and you can't shut it off. It is an awful feeling. But that's what can happen. And the other one I really wanted to mention is pseudobipolar disorder, because calcium can, again, be brings so many psychological symptoms. And so this particular idea was brought forth by Dr. Rick Malter. And so if you guys don't know Rick, he's fantastic. He's now in his 80s. He's still consulting and still teaching. He's a fabulous individual, him and his wife, Rosalie. And he spent his entire career with HTMA and using it as a clinical psychologist. And so one of the things he came up with were patterns related to psychology, which are really groundbreaking in my opinion. And so talking about, this is the chart we looked at earlier with the really severe calcium shell. And when we have, so here's his kind of overview of what we're looking at here. We have a high calcium. We have a low sodium, technically, versus calcium, of course, it's all relative. When we have an elevated calcium to potassium, which remember is the thyroid ratio, we have very low energy. Okay, so that's the first part. When we have an elevation of sodium over potassium, remember that's our stress ratio or our vitality ratio. When it's really high, we have that alarm acute stage of stress. We have intense stress, potentially pain, and agitation. These people are going to be very irritable. They're going to be very aggressive, right? That elevation of sodium over potassium really does drive the stress response to a very heightened, snappy kind of way to respond to any stressor because they really can't handle any more stress. A low calcium to magnesium ratio. So the calcium to magnesium ratio here, if you divide it, it's going to be just over 4, I think. And if we look at the ideal, it's 8. And so it's on the low side. And that can be related to addictions, especially alcoholism. And so that's not a great thing to, now we're kind of in a vicious cycle here. And we've got unstable blood sugar because of loss of magnesium from the cells, right? We need magnesium to regulate glucose. Vitamin D, right? If we're taking vitamin D, that accelerates this pattern because it ends up burning more magnesium and decreasing potassium. And so it really exacerbates the problem. And the last part of this, and this is one that is truly, completely all about Rick, is the active psychological judge. And so I want to talk just a little bit about the judge because I think this is so interesting. And he has actually a book. This is from his Health Freedom presentation from last year. But he does have a book called Free the Inner Child. And it's a really great book. I have a digital copy, so I'll send it over to IHN. And if anybody wants it, you can request it from them. But the judge is in us, right? So and as that sodium to potassium ratio gets bigger, right? Sodium gets higher and higher and higher over potassium, the judge starts to inflate. And the judge is us being critical on ourselves, right? It's worse under the more intense stress, which comes from that really high sodium to potassium. The judge is critical and it triggers that irritability. They also think about anxiety, maybe depression. We've got that alcoholism, the addictions. And then the judge tries to control the inner child. And that's Rick's actual drawing that's in his presentation, in his book. And, he says, you've got this kind of judge hovering over, the little child that's in here that just wants to be happy, right? And being very judgmental and not always being very nice to ourselves. And I think we can, think about that in a lot of different terms within our lives when that could have potentially happened. And when we maybe should have been a little bit more just kind to ourselves, we were being very critical. That could be from that stress, right? That exacerbated stress ratio that we're seeing. So there could be a physiological reason behind that too. And so let's get back into symptoms now. I feel like I go down a rabbit hole when I get into the judge, but it's always a good thing to bring to the table. So irritability, right? Again, when we've got calcium shell, we've got a loss of magnesium. So it could be irritable. There could be insomnia if it's being driven by copper. Sensitivity to EMFs, that's another really common one, actually. Sensitivity to scent as well, right? The body gets broken down a little bit. We're not functioning really well when the calcium is really high. So that can be a potential as well. Joint and muscle pain, super common. Aches, cramps, spasms, poor dental health, or even tooth decay can be an issue. And as I mentioned, I definitely had spinal movement restriction, severe spinal movement restriction, actually. Constipation, when you're going to see in my case study tonight, severe constipation and what that looked like. Asthma can be another one. Decreased metabolic rate, of course. Accelerated aging. Nobody wants that, right? Increased UTIs, panic attacks. Calcium is a very sedative, calming mineral, so is magnesium. So if we have an elevation of tissue calcium where it's not where it should be, and a loss of magnesium, now both of our calming minerals are actually missing, right? So that's when we get into some of these things where we have the anxiety, increased cravings for sugar. I mean, that's going to be based on a really low adrenal output in most cases. Anxiety, kidney stones, as I mentioned, chronic fatigue is another one, impaired circulation, hypothyroid symptoms, weight gain, or the inability to lose weight. That is a hugely common one because we have so much inflammation. Depression, we could have headaches, migraines, and then we've got conditions associated with these too. So we've got diabetes, osteoarthritis, fibromyalgia, premature gray hair, addictions, osteoporosis. So there's a lot that can come from this dysregulation of calcium when we don't have the right things in place. And maybe even we're blindly supplementing because we're being told that that's the right thing to do. And it might be for a few people, but not for everyone. So it's better to know exactly what you need so that, we can not have a host of these symptoms present. So I want to talk about the last three symptoms here, or I would say conditions for two of them at least, because I think they're really interesting to kind of walk through what it looks like before we get into our case study. So premature gray hair. I started mineral balancing, oh my goodness. I feel like I was in my early 40s. Now I'm in my late 40s. I dyed my hair for I don't know how many years. And when I started mineral balancing, I stopped. And I don't have to dye my hair because I don't have any gray hair. So, and people ask me that all the time. They're like, you don't dye your hair? I'm like, no. I'm like, and it's funny because when I start moving metals and moving things, sometimes my hair changes. I'll get some gray hair and then it'll go away. It's very interesting. But so, everybody becomes gray when they get older. It's inevitable, right? But when we start to gray early, Dr. Eck said it's nature's way of warning us we're running out of energy. We're burning the candle at both ends. Our bodies can't keep up. So some people with gray hair will have a great deal of energy, but they're tapping into the reservoirs, which are supposed to be saved, right? So they're burning up energy that's supposed to be in the saved tank in the back. Hair reflects the minerals in our body. It's what gives hair its color. And so if we have dark hair, especially someone like I don't really have dark hair, but someone with really dark hair gets the color from manganese and iron, and they're both needed to produce energy. And so when somebody becomes exhausted, manganese and iron become low. And as they do, the hair begins to lose its color just slightly. Now, when the hair starts to turn white, that's related to more of those white minerals like calcium and zinc, because these are some of the minerals that end up accumulating in the tissues, and they precipitate out into the hair. And now the hair starts to reflect the mineral's color. So I always find that really interesting, just to kind of put, again, a little bit of physiology behind why someone may have premature gray hair. Addictions. We talked about this earlier too, but an increased calcium to magnesium ratio or a decreased calcium to magnesium ratio with a really high loss of magnesium could both lead to addictions. So, and we have an addiction, alcohol numbs the feelings, it lowers magnesium, it drives calcification of the tissue. So it is literally a hamster wheel of what's happening, right? And if we have that relative magnesium deficiency related to really high calcium to magnesium, then we've got low blood sugar, we've got muscle spasms, twitches, tightness, we could have heart arrhythmias, anxiety, panic attack, anger, rage. There's all kinds of things related to that ratio when it's really elevated. And not to mention calcium, like I said, you're a little out of touch with reality. So it's going to impair your judgment. And especially when it's at extremely high levels, and it could block your feelings of awareness. And again, sometimes, that's a defense mechanism to a certain extent. Maybe we don't want to feel our feelings right now, or with something that's happened. And again, that's where calcium can start to build just from an emotional side of things. And so osteoporosis. I don't want to spend too much time on this. I know you guys are going to get the slides, but it's a demineralization of bones. Strong adrenal. This is something that Dr. Eck talked about, is that strong adrenal glands should produce enough estrogen after menopause to maintain adequate estrogen levels. I think boron needs to be included in that, and you'll know why in a minute. Strengthening the adrenal glands is much safer than taking synthetic estrogen. So, there's lots of options nowadays too. That statement was from quite a long time ago, but I think there's a little bit there that still holds true, because I do see a lot of individuals, especially women, who are slow oxidizers. So to give you a comparison, out of everyone that's ever been tested at Trace Elements Labs, which is hundreds of thousands of people, 80% of them are slow oxidizers. And I can tell you in my own practice over the past number of years, I've only seen maybe 2 handfuls, maybe more, maybe 3 handfuls of women that are actually fast oxidizers. Most of them are slow oxidizers. So that means we've got adrenals that aren't functioning optimally. So we really need to think about that. How are we dealing with our stress, and how are we supporting ourselves? So assessing osteoporosis, there's some different patterns to look for. The main one here that we're obviously going to be talking about is high biounavailable calcium, or calcium shell, right? Again, it doesn't have to be calcium shell per se. It just needs to be high biounavailable calcium, because maybe it's not 170 milligram percent, but if it's at 150 or 125, we're most likely going to have the same type of problem. The other thing we have to consider too is that toxic metals play a part. Like lead can replace calcium in bone. Cadmium interferes with zinc and copper metabolism. And when we have imbalances with copper and zinc and those things that are important for bone, then we have more problems, right? Mercury can also affect the thyroid and then the metabolic rate. So there's other things that are, again, kind of going through the process and contributing to what the end result is. So kind of going through those and looking and saying, first, let's start with the metabolic rate. And let's keep it simple, right? To help the calcium absorption restore to a normal level. Then use maybe our boron and our zinc and our manganese. They're all important for bone health, and going through there saying, okay, how do we make these more bioavailable so that everything's being supported? Good nutrition, of course, mild exercise, weight training exercise is great. And of course, some sun exposure, because we want to make sure we're getting some vitamin D from the sun. And boron is really helpful for that too. And I have a whole slide on boron that I know you guys are going to love. So let's talk about basic strategies before we get into our case study. Basic strategies, honestly, these are for elevated tissue calcium, but I think if it was me, I was talking about this earlier with my other students from the first HTMA course. If somebody didn't want to do a test and didn't want to take supplements at all, these 5 supplements would be the ones I would say, at least take these. because the vitamin K2 is going to help shuttle the calcium into the bones and the teeth. The sea salt is going to give us the minerals that we need. Everybody needs a little bit of unrefined sea salt. It's going to help the adrenals. Magnesium, again, helps with our stress response. It helps keep calcium in solution. Boron, critical boron, little trace mineral that nobody talks about, but becoming more and more kind of mainstream now, I guess. And then organic kelp or marine phytoplankton, great overall multi-nutrient. Iodine, we all need that. And, base supplements, I think that's a great list for that. Now let's talk about the mighty boron. I love boron. So it's essential for the growth of and maintenance of bone. Beneficially impacts the use of estrogen, testosterone, and vitamin D. It boosts magnesium absorption, and it has shown to lower calcium and magnesium loss. It protects against pesticide-induced oxidative stress and heavy metals. And so these are just some of what has been written about boron. And so I've included the resource there, of course. And the article, if you Google nothing boring about boron, you will have an article that comes up and you will want to read that. It is filled with amazing information and will most likely wow you. If you've never really looked into boron and never done any research on boron, you're going to want to read that article. So some other things to consider is, again, when we have high tissue calcium, we also have a slow oxidizer. They go hand in hand. Remember, slow oxidizer is high calcium, magnesium, low sodium, potassium. So we want to be able to support the metabolic rate, right? We want to bring it back into balance. So some of those initial things are in here, right? Sea salt, magnesium, K2, boron. We want to include potassium. We want to include selenium for our thyroid, a little bit of vitamin C, A, E, are always good. And then our more stimulatory Bs, B1, 3, 6. And 6 helps with magnesium absorption as well. So we want to cut, that's a really great kind of package for a slow oxidizer to be able to assist in the metabolic rate and to be able to help with that calcium elevation and, of course, magnesium absorption and supporting our underactive thyroid and adrenals, which are going to be present in a slow oxidizer. The nutrition for a slow oxidizer is different than a fast oxidizer. Remember I said earlier, fast oxidizers do really well on, a higher fat, moderate protein, but lower carbs because they burn through them really quickly. The slow oxidizer is kind of on the other side of the fence. They want to have, that higher protein, but more lean protein, right? The chicken, the lower fat seafood, turkey, things like that. Lower fat, so kind of you still need good fat. We still need avocado. We need our, maybe our MCT oil, maybe our grapeseed oil, whatever that looks like, about 2 to 6 tablespoons of added fat. So a little bit on the lower side, lots of starchy and complex carbohydrates, and mostly from veggies, of course. High potassium foods, right? Focusing on that, we need a lot of potassium, and high sodium foods. And again, those are going to help the thyroid. They're going to help the adrenals. And then avoiding those high calcium foods temporarily, right? If we have something that's really high in calcium and your calcium is really high in the tissues, you might want to just put that off to the side until we get the calcium moving and under control. And then you can bring those back in. So I always say there's no diet forever. There's a diet for now, right? Because that diet's going to change as your body changes. So, and then there are some advanced protocols. And so this is something that's in the course that I talk about. And so I just want to kind of touch on them here. High dose B1 therapy, definitely becoming more and more popular. I've been teaching it for quite a long time. I've seen amazing results with clients. And if you guys haven't read the book, it is a fabulous read, and it's called B1 deficiency, dysautonomia, and high calorie malnutrition. And it's all about how B1 deficiency, and I mean B1 deficiency can come from consuming too much alcohol, too much stress. There's a whole slew of things that will promote B1 to be kind of burned up. But there has been correlation with high tissue calcium, with the potential of copper, that biounavailable copper. And as well, sometimes we see that really high cobalt level. We saw that in one of the slides earlier. And those all correlate with a B1 deficiency. So a higher kind of protocol, that's a 3-month protocol for a high dose B1 therapy, can be very advantageous for certain clients. Again, more of an advanced protocol. Infrared sauna is another one. I always say my kind of go-to is if the sodium level is greater than 12 milligram percent, get in the sauna. It's great. I mean, I think it's good for everybody, but you got to be careful when the sodium's really low. If they're really exhausted and you start stimulating the detox from the sauna, it might be a bit too much for them to handle at that point. You need to build the sodium up just a little bit. Chancapiedra's is another one. So when we have really, really high levels of tissue calcium, we could have kidney stones, right? We could have, calcium precipitating. I know for me, when I went through a detox twice of calcium, especially when I was doing, the post EDT a chelation therapy detox of calcium, it was coming out of my teeth, right? You could see white pockets of calcification all over my teeth. So it has to go somewhere. Your body can only put so much back in the bone so quickly. So, we have to make sure that we're not creating things where now the client's going to have to deal with kidney stones. And this is a great addition to be able to kind of keep that ionized, to be able to be excreted. Iodine protocol is another one, right? Some people will use organic kelp. Some people will use iodine itself with the proper protocol. Very, very, very effective. And the last one I want to mention is EFT, right? Emotional freedom technique. You may have someone, the client with the lupus with 543 milligram percent. The second thing I said to her after, here's what we're going to do, is I think you need to find an EFT practitioner that you can work with and talk through some of these things that have happened that you're still dealing with that you haven't released yet, because that will help. We've got to look at the whole picture, and that is part of it. And so, always have a kind of that referral set up. Whereas if you have someone that you need to refer out, then you have someone to be able to refer them to. I think that's really important. So a few more advanced protocols. So let's dive into our case study. So this particular woman came to me, oh my goodness, I guess it was in very early 2021. I think I talked to her in 2020. She had been diagnosed with osteoporosis. She had been supplementing like crazy with a calcium and strontium supplement that was recommended, and then was downgraded to osteopenia. But she came to me because she literally felt like she couldn't do anything anymore. She felt awful. She had severe, I remember her hands, she had like big lumps on her finger joints and her joints here, and her hands were severely immobile. Like she couldn't move her fingers properly. She was severely constipated. She's like, I might go every other day, maybe once a week. Tons of fatigue. She couldn't work out anymore. She loved doing trampolining because, of course, she knew she had osteoporosis, and wanted to do that impact and couldn't do it anymore. And then she was also dealing with some GI distress. So I'm not going to touch a whole lot on this. I will tell you a little bit about what we did, but just recurring bacterial. She had H. pylori that kept coming back, viral infections, and then she was reacting to starchy carbs pretty significantly. And so here's her first test. So we've seen this earlier because this is one of our examples, but her calcium was at 236. And again, she was supplementing, right? So that's where the calcification came from, or what I assumed it came from until I actually put a protocol into place to see how it was going to move. So I only really want to point out three things because there is a lot going on here, but we're only focusing on calcium shell. So we've got a really elevated tissue calcium, we've got a loss of magnesium, and then scroll right over to where you see CO, that's cobalt, off the chart. When cobalt's off the chart, what do we have? We have liver stress, right? We've got liver congestion and we've got malabsorption, right? Because we need cobalt to be in the right range in order to have a really good digestion. And so really dealing with a lot there with regards to that level of calcium and kind of what that supplementation had done over the course of the 12 months that she was utilizing it. So significant ratios on that test, you can see, and I only want to point out two. I want to point out the calcium to potassium because that's her thyroid, 236. This particular thyroid ratio at 236 is one of the highest I've seen. it could point me in the direction of saying, you need to get a full thyroid panel of blood work, which I did, because I want to make sure to rule out, like, are we looking at something else? Are we looking at Hashimoto's, right? Do we have hypothyroidism? So, this kind of gave me a ticket to like, well, maybe not, because, and at the time, she wasn't taking any thyroid medication or any NDT, anything like that. So I wanted to keep it that way. I never supplement or suggest that until I see what we can do with the minerals. And then if we still have blood work problems, then we revisit. Sodium to magnesium, adrenals, 0.09. Her adrenals had literally shut down, right? Her body was not responding anymore. And that's why she was lacking energy. She was feeling, that kind of down. She wasn't feeling well. So what did we do? So we supported all the basics. The slow ox basics I put up there earlier, that's what we did. Supported the basics, that's one. We used a binder. Because remember, I said when you replace vital minerals, sometimes you start detoxing heavy metals because the body just naturally doesn't need them anymore. You need to bind to those, because if you don't, they can just be circulating in the body, causing a whole host of their own symptoms. So that's two. Adrenal glandular. I use an adrenal glandular when I see that ratio is below the reference range, and I find it works really well to support the body, especially if there could be biounavailable copper driving that calcium pattern, because copper needs the adrenal support for the liver to produce the protein it needs for transport. So that's really important. Then we chose a liquid living probiotic because we wanted some GI support, right? She was suffering from a few things. We put in some apple cider vinegar. That can be really helpful, not only just if there's yeast present, but also it helps to kind of decalcify a little bit. So I wanted to put that in once a day. Then we added some liver support. And then we added some enzymes to make sure she was getting the most out of her particular food, of course. So what happened after the second test? I will say she was super dedicated to her protocol. She was super dedicated to her retests. So her second test was literally about 4 months after the first test. And she came back and she said, my hands are better. My hands feel better. I have more mobility in my fingers. My bowels are starting to move regularly. Her fatigue was starting to lift. She had a kind of a general overall feeling of better wellness. She was still having her reaction to starchy vegetables or carbohydrates. We were just, every once in a while, we would try and put that in, but something's still there that didn't like that. She started to slowly exercise. I said mild exercise, right? We're making good progress. So I don't want you to stress your adrenals too much when they're so depleted and your body's dealing with so much already. Her GI symptoms were slowly starting to get better too. So that was good. So here's her retest. And so you see on the bottom of the test, that's the last test results. And then the numbers right under the elements themselves are the newest test. So you can see her calcium came down quite quickly. And, we were using strategies with regards to just making sure to see how things were going to precipitate. And, given the fact that she was supplementing, and that's the reason the calcium went so high, I kind of expected this type of change. But again, you never really know until you see it. And so you can see also her magnesium loss has come down by more than half, right? Her magnesium loss was at 66.8. Now it's at 31.6. So everything's starting to kind of calm. Her sodium potassium really haven't moved much. And I will tell you that she was using a ton of sea salt every day, but her body just wasn't quite ready to shoot up yet. It was still dealing with a lot, and that's okay. The one I did really appreciate was the cobalt. Right? The last one, the cobalt was off the chart. So that means her liver's functioning better now. So that made me, this second test made me really happy. I was like, okay, we're on the right track. You can see also, again, honorable 2 mentions is thyroid and adrenals. Calcium to potassium went from 236 down to 125, of course. And then our sodium to magnesium for our adrenals marginally, but went up to 0.13. So I'm like, okay, I'll take that. We need to keep taking the adrenal glandular, but I'll take it. It's moving in the right direction. Maybe not a lot, but we can't all have a big win. So it was okay. So again, we went back pretty much with the same protocol, But we added in the iodine protocol because the first protocol, I was prepping her with all the cofactors for iodine implementation. And so that's what we added for the second protocol. And then she did her retest the end of last year, which is the third test. So let's see what happened. So her hands were completely mobile and her body even was more supple, right? She didn't have any stiffness in her body. And it's almost like she didn't even realize she had stiffness in her body until it was gone. So that was incredible. Totally regular moving bowels. Her energy was back. She was still feeling really well. Still working on that carbohydrate. That was kind of the last piece of the puzzle that we're still kind of digging away at. And she was using a few things on here too that I didn't include, but I wanted to keep it to what we were actually dealing with calcium. And so we started working with some pancreatic enzymes to see if those would help. And then her exercise has commenced fully. She's been trampolining, which is amazing. And her GI symptoms are much better. Started to explore some nasal sprays just because there was a little bit going on in the sinus that I thought might have been mold exposure. So, dealing with that. But sticking with what we're actually looking at, look at her calcium and magnesium. So her calcium came down nicely over the course of that 3.5 months from 125 to 57. Now it's almost ideal. Her magnesium from 31.6 to 9.2, again, almost ideal. Her sodium went up, which I know that is a stress response. But when you go from a single digit to a double digit of sodium, it means the body's getting stronger. And that was incredible for me to see. So now what I needed to do is just let everything calm just a bit so that the sodium would kind of settle in to a good level there. But everything looked better. Talking about our ratios, so calcium to potassium, look at her thyroid. It went from 125 down to 11.4. So she's on the way to optimal. And her adrenals did a full bounce back from 0.13 to 6.41. So they're almost a little bit they're almost a little bit overactive now. So again, no adrenal glandular this time. She doesn't need it anymore. She just needs to keep doing her exercise and some deep breathing and what have you, but really good results. So again, this one, we did basically the same, but we took out the apple cider vinegar. We don't need to reduce calcium any further. We reduced the iodine she was using because she still needs iodine. She had enough markers that she was still iodine deficient, but iodine is decalcifying. So we don't want to overdo it because her calcium's pretty much getting to that optimal range. We added targeted foods for calcium-rich foods. So it doesn't do well with dairy, but broccoli and leafy greens, all those foods that are rich in calcium, we put those back into the mix. And her retest, I wish I had it already, but I don't, is coming up kind of right now. I wanted her to retest right away after implementing the last protocol and the calcium-rich foods, because I want to know if she needs more than the calcium-rich foods, if she potentially needs a little bit of supplementation as well to make sure that calcium stays at a good level. And so to finish off, HTMA really opened the door for me for my own healing when I was dealing with chronic fatigue, because honestly, if I didn't discover it, I probably would still be suffering. And in the past several years, I've seen thousands of cases where there's been really good, long-lasting results, because really, again, it goes back to those building blocks, that foundation that we're literally building for life. And, the evaluation and assessment of HTMA is critical, whether you're looking at tissue calcium levels, whether you're looking at biounavailable copper, whether you're looking at toxic metals. Minerals really are the building blocks of that underlying health. And so I hope you enjoyed this presentation. There's a little disclaimer, but we're ready for questions. And so I am going to stop share and get back on with Anna.
Yes. Lisa, thank you for sharing that information with us. That was so good.
Oh, I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Who would have thought that the calcium show would have been so good? I had no idea. I didn't have any expectation, but I had no idea you were going to unveil all this amazing knowledge. I'm so fascinated. I'm going to have to watch that again so I can catch it all, right? I mean, it's such an excellent tool, like a support for us practitioners in practice to add to all the other things we do. That is seriously amazing. I am considering doing this with you.
Good. Yeah. It's, it's such a great way for people. Well, and it gives you a way for people to see the results, right? When they see the data, it's like, and sometimes they'll come back to you. They're like, oh, I wish I was feeling better. I'm like, oh my gosh, have you seen your test? Like, it's amazing. The progress is amazing, right? So sometimes they need to see the science and the numbers.
Yeah. I have a question for you from Balwinder. So she says, thank you so much for teaching us on a consistent basis. Regarding this case study, how long did it take to change from osteoporosis to osteopenia?
Well, she came to me, so she was in osteopenia when she came. And so to regulate the calcium, she started the beginning of 2021, and the last test was in November of 2021. So it took about 11 months to normalize her calcium levels.
Wow.
Yeah.
With those protocols, like that was so interesting. Like just the way everything is just related, how you're able to see with the different minerals, like what's actually going on. It's so, I just loved it. Is what your, the content of this talk, will this be added? Is this part of what you're going to be teaching in the course?
Not exactly. It is in the course. So the course is much more in depth. We actually go through all of those advanced protocols, right? So I talk about all of those. And I think that, the advanced protocols is something that, even with clients, I mean, you might use them a couple of years down the road. It might not be something you're like, a lot of people aren't comfortable with iodine, but I use iodine with almost every client, right? Just because I've used it for so many years and saw so many amazing results. When you get used to something in your practice, it's very easy to implement, but not everybody has to use that. Not everybody has that comfort level, but there's other options, right? You can use your organic kelp and get good iodine from that and get other multi-nutrient support. So there's lots of options and ways to implement it successfully into your practice. Yeah.
Well, excellent. Let's see. I think I might have another question here. Let me see. So Sarah says, I broke my leg and shattered my knee. So I'm taking calcium, vitamin K2, boron, vitamin D, silicon, etc. Any idea how long I should supplement for?
My goodness, that breaks definitely aren't my specialty. To be honest, the first thing I tell people, because should you be supplementing, right? Are you using the right thing? Test, right? Don't guess what you should be doing or how long you should be doing it. Do a test, see what all those levels look like. And silica, I think is important regardless, right? Even if you're using something as a binder like diatomaceous earth, a good quality, of course, for a good source of silica, that's for bones, obviously. But I think there's a lot of other pieces in there. You've got all the right pieces, but are they right for you? That's the question, right? Because if you're a slow oxidizer and you're just elevating your tissue calcium, then maybe you should be using a much higher dose of boron and some magnesium and, other things to be able to make that, happen, right? Yeah.
Excellent. So yeah, this was really fantastic. And I just want to say, the Con Ed class is happening starting June 14th. Yes. And I know that that's going to go on for, I think that's for 6 weeks.
6 weeks. Yes.
Can you add a little bit about that?
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if you can see, obviously the IHN on the IHN page, you can see where the write-up is. So there's lots of info there. There's a landing page there. There is, you can see what each course syllabus is. You can see what other students have said. You can read a little bit more about it. And yeah, so each class is 3 hours and there's lots of case studies, right? That with protocols attached. And I'm actually just finalizing. So what I've been using in my practice, I finally named it. Because my team is getting bigger. I'm like, I need to put a name on this. So I named it the Foundation Mineral Protocol. I'm like, it's the foundation. I say that 1,000 times a day if I say it once. So I'm like, it's the Foundation Mineral Protocol. And I'm like, this is what we're going to call it. And it is such an effective tool. And I've kind of developed it like really over the past, 6-7 years. And it's a protocol. I call it the phase 4 protocol. So each phase is 4 weeks. All the implementation schedules there. It's super easy. And the one part about HTMA that everybody really struggled with was the fact that, when you saw that list of supplements, you're like, oh, the first one's, I have 5. Oh, sea salt, MK7, whatever. Like there's boron. Okay, fair enough. But you put on all the slow ox supplement. That's a lot. That's a big list, right? And so that's one of the reasons that I came up with Vicon itself, not even just for supplements, to be honest. It was for custom formulations based on HTMA. So you can literally easily be able to have clients have good results like the ones I showed you, but they take a powder twice a day with all of that stuff in it, right? Yeah. So it's simple. There's no pill fatigue. There's no overwhelmed, here's your list of 30 supplements I want you to take because you need them. And everybody's like, oh my gosh, I can't do it, right? And so now you can take here's your powder. You need a binder. Maybe you need a probiotic right now. And maybe you need your adrenal glandular, right? Or some kelp, right? It's simple. There's 4 or 5 things. It's one and done, right? So I found a tremendous improvement. And client retention is, I've heard from, many practitioners, the client retention is crazy because they're just like, oh my gosh, I need more. Like, do I need to retest? Can I just get a refill? So it's a great way to be able to implement it really in more of a stress-free fashion rather than clients trying to shop for multiple supplements.
Exactly. No, that's excellent. When you keep it all in that one packet, that's just perfect because it does. People get that supplement anxiety about having.
They do. Oh my gosh. People would leave my office when I was at ACI was like, oh my gosh, what am I supposed to do with all this? I'm like, here's your list. Good luck. Right. I was like, oh goodness.
I know we can find out all about this in your course.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, you guys, you can reach out to me. I've put the link in the chat box so you guys can see on the IHN website, and you can certainly reach out to me with more questions or Lisa. But this was wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us and all your valuable information with us. I'm sure you're going to be packed class like the last one. So again, thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for coming out tonight. And I hope to see you guys all soon. Take care. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you so much, Anna. And thank you, everyone. Appreciate your time. And I'm glad you were here.